All right. Hey, good morning, everyone. Can you do me a favor real quick? Can you high five your neighbor and say, welcome to church? Can you do that real quick? Yes, so glad you guys made it out today. As many of you guys know, actually over the past few weeks, we've actually been in a sermon series called All In. And All In is basically this kind of idea that what we've been talking about is, and if you're not a Christian here, it's a great Sunday to be here, because really the theme that we've been talking about is this idea that what it means to be a follower of Jesus is that it's not some kind of half-hearted, maybe I'm 75% of the way there. Certainly there's a journey that each of us are on in our spiritual quest for truth and for God and whatnot. But nonetheless, Jesus has this saying, right, where he basically says, sell everything and follow me. And what he's basically saying is either Jesus is Lord of all or he's not Lord at all. And that's what we've been exploring over the past few weeks is what does it mean for my relationships? What does it mean for my money? What does it mean for my career? What does it mean for my attention and my affections? For everything to basically be under kind of the lordship of Jesus and to say, God, I'm all in, because either he's Lord of all or he's not Lord at all. And so that's the theme that we've been exploring. And in today's sermon is actually we're gonna cap off this message series on All In, and we're gonna talk about this idea of becoming a fool for God. And you probably noticed that word coming up quite a bit in the letter that was written from Paul, who's one of the founders of Christianity. He writes to the church in Corinth. Now, Corinth in the ancient world was a cosmopolitan city, much like New York, which was basically a hub for all sorts of activity, merchant activity, arts, et cetera, et cetera. And so to the church in Corinth, you'll see what Paul is talking about as this small kind of movement of Christianity starting to grow. Now, if you can imagine, right, because Christianity was an offshoot of the Jewish religion, this person by the name of Jesus, who was this peasant nobody. He was a carpenter. He's not even part of the religious establishment. In fact, he's so like kind of a mundane nobody. He's just this ordinary fellow, and yet this movement of Christianity started by following this person named Jesus, who Christians claimed was born of the Virgin Mary and kind of lived this life as a Jewish peasant person, but ended up amassing this incredible following, claiming to be God himself, claiming to be the Son of God. He ends up dying on a cross. He gets crucified. So this carpenter gets crucified. But 3 days later, he rises from the dead and a revolution begins that would change the entire world. That would change even, if you can imagine, that was done during the time of Roman power. And the Roman Empire, of course, during that era, and of course in any era, was known as one of the strongest, most influential empires ever. And yet here's this no-name Jewish carpenter who's upending the world's social order by dying on a cross and resurrecting from the grave. And so here Jesus is then, right? Jesus is going proclaiming, and then he ascends into heaven, and his followers begin to tell the good news of who this Jesus is. And so Paul is one of these people who have been radically changed and converted, following this Jesus fellow, and look at what he does to describe the message of the cross, the message of what Christianity is all about. Check it out. This is what he says. He says, for the message of the cross, this idea that this Jewish carpenter died on the cross for your sins and for mine and resurrected, this idea, this cross, check out what it says. It's foolishness. Let me hear you say foolishness. Now, this word foolishness, it's the same, the word is the word moria. We get words like moron from it, or Mets fans. No, I'm just kidding. Like morons. This message is foolishness. It's moronic. Anyone who believes this stuff is a moron to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power. Let me hear you say power. Now, this word for power in the Greek is the word dunamis. Can I hear you say dunamis? Now, the word dunamis is the word, we get words like dynamite from it, or dynamic. So here's what Paul is basically doing. He's juxtapositioning this idea of foolishness, this moronic thing, to somehow being equivalent to dynamite, to this explosive, world-changing, revolutionary starting truth, the power of God. Now, he says, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent. I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Now, the word wise, the Greek word is the word sophos. We get words like philosophy from it, or sophomoric. And this word sophos, this idea of wisdom, is also here. And notice what you're going to see in this entire passage is this interplay between foolishness, moronic, to dynamite, to wisdom. and how the foolishness of God is actually the true dynamite, not the wisdom of this world. And that's why Paul is saying this. He's saying, where's the teacher of the law? Where's the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish? Has not God made moronic? The wisdom, the so-called wisdom that this world is driven by, that this empire is driven by, has God not called that foolish? The wisdom of the world. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him. See, there's a different kind of wisdom. Either you're following the world or you're following God. God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs. Now he's talking about his primary audiences here. The Jews, of course, where Christianity was kind of an offspring of, the Jews demand a sign. Of course, the sign would be some sort of parting of the Red Sea. It would be some sort of miracle. But like a crucified carpenter, that is not who we believe would deliver us. Do you understand? And this is what Paul is basically saying. The Jews demand a sign, and Greeks look for wisdom. Because, of course, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, the idea of philosophy and rhetoric were so prized as being the most extraordinary things. And so you've got sophist philosophy, Epicurean philosophy. You've got all sorts of these movements of classical philosophy that was birthed out of this era. Because this is what the Greeks, they valued this so much, was philosophy and the brilliance of one's mind and how one's mind could really deter what truth is. And Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a carpenter who died on a cross, a stumbling block to the Jews and moronic to Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. You see, he's juxtaposing how different this foolish message is all about. And so he says, for the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. That word strength is the same word, dynamite, dunamis. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. It's the same word, dynamite. Not many were mighty or powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish, the moronic things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things. That word for lowly is the same word. Again, it continues to repeat. It's this foolish thing. God chose the foolish, the moronic things of this world and the despised things and things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Now, here's what Paul is basically saying. He's saying that the message of Christ, the message of Christianity, it's moronic to its hearers. Whether you're from a religious background, whether you're from an irreligious background, whether your God is philosophy, whether your God is miracles and signs and wonders. Like, this is such a moronic tale. The tale that somehow the one that we follow is someone who would die on a cross and resurrect from the grave, but he's just this Jewish carpenter. It's moronic. It's foolishness. Now, because of that, check out what Paul says. He says, I'll go to the slide before that. And so it is with me, brothers and sisters, when I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's dynamite, so that your faith might not rest on human sophos, on human philosophy, on human ingenuity, on human self-reliance, on human capacity. No, but it might rest on God's dynamic power. Now, do you see what Paul is saying? He's saying this whole idea then of the Christian journey is that it's not about you and your self-sufficiency and the ways that you're so strong and so good at everything. It rests solely on God and his power. And this is what the Christian journey is. It's this submitting, it's this surrendering my life to a higher power. It's saying that I'm not the one that's in control of my destiny and my journey. Now, the thing is, in a city like ours, I mean, us New Yorkers, we are good at being self-sufficient. We pride ourselves on being the best of the best of the best. I remember Tina and I, during our anniversary trip, we were in Italy, And I remember going to Italy, and, Tina was like, oh, I can't wait to try the food there. And I'm like, oh, yeah, it's okay, So we end up going to Italy. And so we get to Italy, and she's like, oh, we can try Roman pizza. So we're in Rome, and she's like, let's go get some Roman pizza. I'm like, okay, cool. So we go, and then, we ordered some pizza, and she ate it, and she's like, oh, this is so good. I remember biting into it, and I was like, New York is better. New York is, the pie on 56th Street is way better than this, And, but she's just like, oh, I can't believe you're saying that. But it was true. And, but that's the thing. You and I, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Even as I'm sharing this story, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because the story of our city and the story of New York is that we are the best and the brightest and the most self-reliant. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. That's right. You all know that story. I know that story. That is such a part of the fabric of our culture and the city that we live in. There's a part of me, and I didn't actually even grow up here. For those of you who were raised here, I can't imagine how arrogant you are. No, I'm just kidding. But, there's this thing, right? I've been here for 18 years now. So, and there's this moment, right, where a family will, all of a sudden they'll tell us, hey, we decided to move to Jersey or something, I'm like, oh yeah. It's not for everyone. The city is not for everyone. Not everyone can kind of make it here. There's just this weird, there's this weird arrogance. And there's this weird, New York is the end all, be all. We're the best of the best of the best of the best. And here's what it breeds within you and within me and within the culture that we live in. Honestly, it's this I'm pretty smart, pretty driven. I can make it. I can do it. Or I'm going to die trying to do it. I'm going to keep working my tail off so I can show the world out there what a success I am. How great my family is. Isn't this the narrative? Isn't this the story that so many of us are longing after? The story of success, the story of ambition, the story of achievement. And this city is wrought with it. And here's the thing. Because we do have the best pizza in the world, you and I, we probably deserve it, honestly. We probably deserve to have that mentality. Because you know what? The grit that it takes to live here, the ambition that it takes to thrive here, yeah, we all know that the reason why we're still here is because we believe we have it. But you know what that means for you and for me? It makes me awfully arrogant. It makes me awfully proud. And it makes me somehow think that due to my own brilliance and due to my own kind of capacity, that I can do this thing on my own. And the reality is there's so many times, even when it comes to faith, where my faith is not resting on the foolishness of God. It's resting on the power of my own human wisdom. And oftentimes, whether you're a Christian or you're not, and some of you have done this religious game for years, and this is what you do. This is what you do. You're a professional religious person. And you and I, we know this because I can play that game too. I can play the game like I'm all in with God. But the reality is, when it comes down to trusting the foolishness of God or my own wisdom or my own 401k or my own investments or my own capacity or my own GPA or my own career or my own LinkedIn profile, whatever it might be, when it comes down to that choice, maybe I'll do a little bit of the religious game, but my chips are all in with my own wisdom. And oftentimes, the one thing that's holding you back, the one thing that's holding me back from being all in, from surrendering, from being all in, and we've used this image of falling backwards into his arm in this vulnerable moment. The one thing that's holding you back and me back is your intellect, is how smart you are, is how great you are. It's how much capacity you have. It's how much moxie and pride you have in yourself. The question for you and for me, because here's what being all in means. Because being all in means is that you're willing to become a fool, moron. Now, here's the thing. I know some of you are like, how dare he say that? Well, here it is again. Being all in means that you're willing to become a moron, a fool. Someone who entrusts your entire life. Not just some of your life, not just, maybe some of your time, but everything, your money, yourselves, your relationship, your future, your ambitions. It's someone who gives all of that, who says all of this, I consider loss and rubbish towards the wisdom that's found in the foolishness of following you, Jesus. And the question that I have for you and for me today is, are we willing to become fools? Are we willing to become morons? Are we willing to say before God, God, I am all in. I'm willing to become a fool for you. To go beyond my own pride and my intellect. Now, this is not saying that we park our brains at the door, et cetera, because time and time again, the scriptures and Jesus and others would talk about how love the Lord your God with all your mind. And there's all sorts of ways in which our minds are supposed to be stimulated with the things of God. But you and I know the heart disposition of being a fool who's entrusted yourself, who's obeying God no matter what. And some of us, we're willing to entrust some of who we are, but the rest of our lives, we simply rely on our own capacity. Now, here's the thing. The people in this room went to great schools, you have great jobs, or you've got this drive that's brought you to the city. And so here's what I know. What's true of you, what's true of me, what's true of our city is we are so dang self-reliant. We are so focused on what we can do to sustain ourselves. And the invitation to you is, will you become a fool today? Because here's what Paul is basically trying to say. He's trying to say, God is God, and you are not. In fact, high five your neighbor and say, God is God, you are not. Can you do that real quick? That's right, God is God, you are not. But the reality is we function as if we are our own gods. We have our own futures, our own destinies. But don't you understand? God, just with it, in a nanosecond, God could cause the Earth's orbit to just spin out of control. Don't you see this? God could just snap his fingers and allow the Patriots to lose next week. Don't you understand? Wow, there was no cheering for the orbit thing, but for the Patriots going down. Don't you understand? Do you see? If God is God, creator of all things, the one who holds just everything in his hands, if God is this vast God, this higher being, and you and I are not. There's no government, there's no country, there's no person, there's no philosopher, there's no athlete, there's no wealthy, there's no one that can ever stand it. And you and I, no matter how much money you amass, no matter how much success you amass, no matter how bright you are, no matter kind of what you got on your IQ score or your SATs, whatever you might use to kind of give yourself your own credibility of how strong you are, how smart you are, how much you've got things together, how much smarter you are than everyone else, how much better you are than those other cities and these other people. No matter what you and I might say to ourselves about how great we are, don't you understand? God is still God. You and I are not. And in a second, our lives could be taken from us. Just in a second. And all of us at one point or another, and death is the final kind of arbiter of this moment, isn't it? It's the final arbiter of this moment that tells us that like we are not God. And no matter how you and I might try to tell ourselves that we're the most important people in the world or we're the center of the universe, don't you understand? God is God, and you and I are not. You see, this is why Paul says this, right? This is why Paul says in verse 25, he says, for the foolishness, the moronic things of God, okay? The foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. All these people pontificating about the meaning of life and what happens after I die. He's like, don't you understand this? The foolishness of God, that God himself, the moronic things, that's even wiser than the wisest that human beings have to offer. And the weakness of God is stronger than human dynamite, is stronger than human power. Don't you see this? God is God, and you and I are not. The question is, will you become a fool? Will you recognize that? And will you then begin to entrust and fall into his arms? You know, throughout the history of kind of human philosophy, if you look at the history of kind of thought and philosophy, you'll notice that there have been so many brilliant people who have tried to tackle some of the more impossible questions of life. But the questions that every single one of us as human beings wrestle with. Questions of meaning and purpose and beginnings. And no matter what, every single human philosopher, really, they've tried to answer questions about these four things. But the reality is, anyone who's ever tried to brilliantly explain these four things, at the end of the day, because of the limits of the human experience, the human mind, could never fully give the fullest description of these four things, of love, of death, of suffering, and of eternity. And certainly throughout histories, religions, and ages, people have talked and posited different truths about wisdom and philosophy and how one is supposed to find meaning. And you've got one extreme of secular humanism, and then you've got other extremes about what they believe about what this God person is like. And like what Paul is basically saying is all the writings, all the brilliance that have been posited by humans, like it's foolishness compared to God's wisdom. Don't you see? It's like the human strength is nothing compared to God's strength. And you see, in the message of the cross, in the message of Jesus, it's the only news that tells us about a God, who is transcendent, a God who is the creator, and yet a God who has come close. And when questions of love and suffering and death and eternity are posited, you see, Jesus would answer and begin to describe what the God of the universe wants to reveal to you and to me about what every soul has longed for when it comes to these things. Jesus would begin to teach, and this is what he would say. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. Whoever believes in him would not perish, but have eternal life. And in the message of God's foolishness, what God would want to reveal to you and to me is that God being God, even though he's the God who holds everything and with a thought and a whisper could change everything, the weather, the economy, your life, your breath, and mine. He could do any of these things. This God. The foolishness is that he would become the fool. He would send his Son to live and to die, to show you and me how deeply in love, how deeply committed he is to you and to me. And the invitation from God then is, will you just surrender to his love? Will you surrender to his life? Will you surrender to his love and become a fool who's been caught up in love? I remember when my wife Tina and I were dating, she actually lived in Union Square, and I lived in a neighborhood called Elmhurst, Queens. Anyone been to Elmhurst, Queens? That's what I thought. Yeah, not many, because folks are like, it's Elmhurst. Why would I go to Queens? I know you all, Manhattan people, proud and arrogant. But I lived in, I remember when I knew I wanted, I was way earlier in the relationship in wanting to marry her before she wanted to marry me. Just don't tell her I said that. But anyhow, but I remember when I had resolved that, and just kind of being lost in love. And I remember what I would do is like, I would wake up super early in the morning, like 4 or 5 a.m. sometimes. And I would take the train from Elmhurst, Queens to Union Square area where she lived. And I would find a way to get to her apartment door. And then I would just put a card there so that she would see it when she woke up and stuff, or when she was walking out the door. And I would just put the card there. I'd walk away. And then I'd make the whole journey all the way back to Queens. And I remember telling my brother this. I was like, hey, you know what I did today? Like I dropped this card off. And, I thought my brother would be like, oh, wow, you're amazing. No, he was like, dude, you're such an idiot, man. Like, why would you, who cares, man? Why would you do that? Why would you make that, the cost benefit of that? Like, but you and I know, if you ever experience this, when you're surrendered to love, and you are a fool. And in many ways, that's the invitation of the Christian journey. Will you just surrender to love and become a fool? Will you just, last fall, I was going through a really stressful time, and we actually had our worship and prayer night that our church does, the same one that we're having this Friday night. And, it was full, and people were singing and all this stuff. And Tina and I were sitting, like, right over there, and we're sitting there. And as I'm going through this tough time, we're singing, right? And I raise my hands like this as we're singing. And I'm like, oh, your promises are yes and amen. And like, I had my hands up and I'm singing this song and I'm just going for it. I'm like, blast. I'm like, ah, right? Like, and Tina, my wife was next to me. She like taps me on the shoulder. She's like, hey, you're louder than the speaker, because we're right next to the speaker. It's like, you're louder. Okay, like, what's going on? And I just remember, and I was talking to someone last week about this, actually, someone who goes to our church, and she was talking about, like, how weird, and she's somewhat kind of new to faith, and she's like, why do you raise your hands? Like, why do you do that? It just seems kind of weird. And I said to her, honestly, I do it sometimes, not because I'm feeling anything, like, not because I'm like, I just do it as a way to say, I'm a fool, and I surrender. It's not like some magical kind of mystical words are emanating from my fingertips to God or anything. Like I just said, honestly, I just do it because when I do this, it just makes me feel like, you know what, God, just a moron for you. And honestly, so many times I care more what people think than I care about, like, you. And I want to put myself now in a place where I just don't give a rip. And I remember as I was singing that song and I'm just belting it out. And I was telling this woman last week, I was saying, when I raise my hands and I sing these songs and I do it at the top of my lungs, it's just a way for me to say, God, I just want to be a fool for you. And I don't want to care so much about what people think of me. I just want to be all in with you. And I know so often my pride, my intellect, my sophistication, my calculated belief about what is proper keeps me from being a damn fool. And yet here's the invitation. Will you surrender to God's love? Will you just surrender and be, God, I'm all in, because you're God, I'm not. And I just want to surrender to your love. You know, one of my favorite things that we do as a church is we celebrate these things called baptisms. Because baptisms are these moments in which we get to say, here I am, a fool for God. Here I am. That's why I'm up here. I'm sharing because I am a fool. Christy, I don't know if you knew that or that was in the baptism class, but I'm a fool. Here I am. I'm all in. Whatever may come, whatever befalls, here I am. I am a fool. I'm all in. There's no turning back. Here I am.